Hi, I'm Dr. Hackie Reitman. Welcome to another episode of Exploring Different Brains. Today I'm very excited to be speaking with Dan Habib, an award-winning filmmaker who's got a new project coming out, a new documentary and a new thing, and he's going to tell you all about. And welcome to the show, Dan.
Thank you, Aki. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I got to tell you, I got such a thrill out of reading about you online with the different films you made and what got you into it and everything. And I can't wait to share it with our Different Brains audience because you get it. You get this whole deal, don't you?
Well, I think you can appreciate that I get it only because my son Samuel has taught me everything I know pretty much. I think many of us as parents, our kids are the ones that really bring us into a world that we never quite expected to be in. So yeah, if I get it, it's because of Samuel.
Yeah, ditto over here too. Tell us, introduce yourself to our audience. They haven't met you before, although a lot of them have seen you on all the national media you've been on, but introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, I was a photojournalist actually for about 20 years before I got into filmmaking. So professionally, filmmaking is relatively new for me. I've been doing it about 10 years. And it wasn't a career path I had ever expected to take. You know, my wife and I moved to New Hampshire almost 30 years ago I was doing newspaper work, doing a lot of freelance documentary work, and I would do stories on migrant workers, on welfare reform. I covered 6 New Hampshire presidential primaries. You may know that New Hampshire is a
Wow.
big political state. And I loved my work as a photojournalist. But when we had our son Samuel, which was almost 17 years ago now, actually almost 18 years ago, life changed pretty rapidly because we determined that he had cerebral palsy about 5 or 6 months into his life, and also an underlying health condition called mitochondrial disorder, which caused a lot of underlying health fragility, seizure disorders, things like that. So, as I'm sure a lot of your audience can appreciate, when you realize that your child has a disability, many things change in your life. And it took a few years, but there was one point in my life when Samuel actually got very sick. He got pneumonia from a tonsillectomy. He had aspirated some blood and things didn't go so well. And it was a very difficult moment for us. He was about 3 and a half and he was in critical condition for about 2 weeks. And during that time, his neurologist, who was also the attending in the ICU, said to me, you're a photojournalist. He'd gotten to know us. Have you ever thought of telling the story of what it's like to be a parent of a child with a disability? And I said, not really. But he said, it would be a powerful story for you to tell. And I started bringing my camera to the hospital just to honestly burn off some of the stress I was feeling, the anxiety you can appreciate we were feeling at that point. I started taking some pictures in the hospital, didn't really know where it would go. But once Samuel thankfully stabilized, got out of the hospital, got back to health, I said, maybe I should pursue this. So I started doing a documentary still essay on Samuel, which then I realized, if I really want to reach young people, video is the currency of young people these days. And so I decided to shift to video. Yeah. So anyway, that led me down the path of creating the film, including Samuel, which took me about 3 years to make while I was still director of photography at the newspaper. Once that came out in 2008, about 10 years ago, I decided I wanted to devote myself full time to filmmaking. And from that point on, I've just been doing documentary film work here based at the University of New Hampshire Institute on Disability. And I've been doing that full time for the last 10 years.
What a great story. Now, many in our audience are ignorant of cerebral palsy because it doesn't get a lot of the press that some of the other highlighted neurodiversities do. Why don't you tell us about cerebral palsy?
Right. Well, the way I describe it to your audience would be the way I describe it to anybody that asks about Samuel's disability, which is that he has some trouble connecting his brain to his muscles. His brain just doesn't direct his muscles very efficiently. And that can happen for a lot of different reasons. I think there's a conception that cerebral palsy is inherently a birth injury, but in actually the majority of cases, it's not a birth injury. People think it's like an oxygen deprivation at birth, but in many, many cases, it's a genetic disorder, it's a mitochondrial disorder, metabolic disorder, which all means at the cellular level, something is going wrong in the processing. There's something that's not quite clicking. And so in those situations, that can cause a brain injury in utero, which is what happened with Samuel, and it can have a lot of complications. In Samuel's case, it did create such difficulty with him navigating his muscular functions that he uses a wheelchair, he has trouble speaking, and he uses a communication device. But I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk more about this. I want your viewers to know Samuel's also almost always on the honor roll. He's a high school senior. He's looking forward to going to college. He's going to the homecoming dance Saturday night. He's got a date. He's playing 3 sports. He does a lot of public presenting. He's a filmmaker. So there's so many. I don't want to shoebox or shoehorn Samuel into this mindset of he's just the disability. He's obviously, like you appreciate, has so many more things going on.
Well, it's well said. And back in the old days, when I was becoming an orthopedic surgeon, one of the best years I spent was a whole year at what used to be called the Shriners Hospital for Crippled Children in Springfield, Massachusetts. For that whole year, I lived with the kids. I stayed in the hospital, became part of them, and we just had a great experience. And what I started to see then, that I think much more so now, is how everything overlaps. All the systems overlap and everything, and the basic science now is moving more and more toward, as you say, the cellular mitochondrial level. And in addition to that, I think when the final history is written, that all stuff is going to evolve from the mitochondrial level, from the autoimmune system, what we call infections, which are probably really immune phenomenon. And I think great strides are being made now. One of the overlaps in cerebral palsy is the rubella and other diseases like that. How has from your point of view, how has the approach to cerebral palsy changed in the past 17 years?
Wow, that's interesting. I honestly haven't seen a tremendous number of changes, for better or for worse. I think that what is probably changing the fastest, as you can appreciate, is our understanding of the genetic makeup of human beings and the fact that they're diagnosing things that they couldn't diagnose before. So, 20 or 30 years ago, Samuel, they probably would have just thought he must have had some kind of birth injury. They would not have been able to do the diagnostic work to know that he has a mitochondrial disorder. The benefit to knowing that is that his doctor has been able to target his medicine, and not just his prescription meds, but even over-the-counter vitamins. He takes all these vitamins and supplements that turbocharge the mitochondrial process. And our neurologist has prescribed those because he's really understood the nuances of the mitochondrial process. I think honestly, I think that we of course focus a lot on keeping Samuel healthy and getting him the right medicine and treatment and therapies. But I think as much or more of our life is focused on disability rights, inclusive education, and just opportunities for him to be successful and completely integrated into all aspects of our society without having to minimize any aspect of his disability, but totally accepting his disability for where he is and working more on society and working to fix society much more than we're fixing Samuel.
And right now we're in the middle of National Disability Employment Month.
That's
now.
right.
And employment, as Temple Grandin has said, that's where the rubber meets the road.
Right, exactly. And we're very focused on that for Samuel. I mean, I've been fortunate to do a lot of film work around the country, some of which looks at transition issues for kids transitioning from high school to college and career, and understand what some of the best practices are, what some of the promising approaches are. And one of the things they say is if a kid has some paid work experience in high school, a kid with a disability, they're much more likely to achieve integrated employment as an adult. If they have some household chores, they're much more likely to achieve that. If they have internships and mentorships, so you can believe that we're doing all those things, including household chores for Samuel.
Tell us what it was like. You had the honor and privilege and did such good work when President Obama appointed you to the President's Committee for People with Disabilities. Tell us what that was like.
Sure, and I'm still on that committee actually, although we have not met under the new administration. We'll see how that goes. You know, you never know. But it's called the President's Committee for People with Intellectual Disabilities specifically. It's been a fascinating and I think a very important project. You know, we meet several times a year in Washington. It's not a job. It's really more of a volunteer, role. But it can be quite demanding at times because we're charged with basically with every year writing a report to the president recommending what needs to happen in the world of disability to keep things moving forward, to keep creating opportunities in education and employment, in community life for people of all abilities and disabilities. So we did, for instance, one report that was just on technology access and how can we continue to advance technological access, both kind of specialized technology for people just with disabilities, but also access to mainstream technology, whether it's iPhones or computers or transportation. So that was one report. We did another report looking at pathways to inclusive lives through education, through employment, through having self-determination when it comes to guardianship issues, things like that. So so it's been powerful. You know, I can't honestly have never met the president in that capacity. He wasn't spending time with us. I don't know that I'll meet President Trump in that capacity. But what we did see was the reports that were issued actually had some policy impact. We saw things happening at the federal level that were came out of these reports. And in fact, the ABLE Act, I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a well-known policy that came into reality the last couple of years that allows people with disabilities to save up to $100,000 without affecting their benefits. So it's a really important policy change that has occurred because in the past, if you earned even $5,000, $10,000, you could lose your Social Security money. You know, and so there was no incentive to work and no opportunities. That ABLE Act grew out of a previous report from the Presidential Committee.
Who are some of the other champions that you work alongside with in general? Who are some of your heroes in the whole movement?
I've got some heroes for sure. I mean, one of my most current heroes and current friends is a woman named Judith Heumann, Heumann. She is a longtime disability rights advocate. She was in Berkeley during the really intense times when they were trying to get Section 504 passed, which is really important legislation. She helped work on the Americans with Disabilities Act. She's been involved in almost every major piece of legislation. She ran the education policy under I think she was under President Clinton. So and one of the cool things is that she and I have become friendly and I've met talked to her at conferences. And so when it came time for Samuel to do his final project for sophomore year, and it had to be a project about a civil rights movement, she agreed to Skype with him for an hour and do an interview. So he did a fabulous film that if your viewers are interested, just go to YouTube and just Google Samuel Habib, Judith Heumann, Heumann, and it'll pop up. It's free. And it's like a short history of the disability rights movement. And it's Samuel interviewing her on Skype, and it's all video taped. He created it. He put the music in. He put the videos in. So she's really important. I would also say Bob Williams is a very long time serving U.S. federal government official in a lot of different departments. And I got a chance to interview him about 10 years ago, maybe even longer, when I was starting, including Samuel, and when Samuel was very young. And I said, listen, as the parent of a child with a disability, what's the best advice you can give me? And Bob is a man who can't speak, uses a communication device, but was basically Clinton's right-hand person for disability policy. And he said, just give him choices at every step of the way. Create self-determination, foster self-determination all the time. And that was very powerful advice. And my wife and I have taken that to heart. So those are a couple people. I mean, there's famous people like Ed Roberts, obviously Temple Grandin, is fantastic. And then there are a lot of young people who are up and coming in the movement who are doing incredible work. I could throw out lots of names, but there's a whole new generation of disability rights leaders that I'm really excited about.
What bit of advice would you have? Someone in our audience has a child with cerebral palsy. What advice would you give them?
Well, there's so many directions to go with that. I mean, all I could say is that for us, a couple of things have really guided my wife and I and my family in this journey of the last 18 years. One is to come up with a vision for your child that's a very high vision, high expectations for what you think and what they can achieve. It doesn't mean it's not going to be a bumpy road. Doesn't mean they'll achieve every aspect of that vision. But for us, the vision was that Samuel would feel like he belonged. He would feel like he belonged in our family, in our neighborhood, in our community, and certainly in our public school. In fact, I couldn't imagine him feeling like he belonged unless he felt like he belonged in our own local public school. So that's why we fought and advocated so hard for inclusive education. We're fortunate that our district is generally quite inclusive, and Samuel's always been in regular classes. And I've never for 1 second of my life regretted that we have pushed hard and that he has been in general education classes, even though at times it's challenging, academically, like it is for many kids. At times logistically, there's a lot of things we need to figure out. It has connected him to the community. It has created an amazing number of friendships. It's exposed him to a really high level of educational discourse. So I think that's critical. I think, obviously it all starts with health. I mean, you have to focus on health. You have to have doctors and specialists that you trust. And once you find that physical therapist or occupational therapist or speech therapist that you believe in and that you really feel is going to do great work on behalf of your child, do not let go of them. Hold on and grab their ankles and don't let them go anywhere. And I think that's really important, building a network around. And then I think, I really do think also that we had to learn that we couldn't spend our whole life trying to fix Samuel. That is not what it's about. We want to keep him healthy, but we have come fully to accept his disability, and he accepts his disability. In fact, he embraces his disability at this point. I have asked him many times since he was 7 or 8 years old, Samuel, if you could just get rid of your cerebral palsy, would you? And he always says no. It is now a part of his identity. Just like if you ask that same thing to a black person or a person who might be gay or have a different sexual orientation, they would say, this is just who I am. I can't imagine myself not being this way. Even though it's hard sometimes to be in a minority group that can be discriminated against, like the ones I mentioned, it's also a full part of your identity. And for Samuel, he's very proud of his identity as a person with a disability. He wishes he didn't have all his doctor's appointments and blood draws. He would get rid of those in a second. But he's accepted who he is, and I think that's something that the parents can model from a very early age, to accept the child for who they are and where they are.
Since you've become involved, how has the neurodiversity movement changed?
Well, I'll be honest, it's not what I would consider an area of my expertise, but what I would say from my own experience is I'm pretty well connected to groups like ASAN, Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, Autism Society of America, and again, it's not all about autism, but I think a lot of the leadership within the neurodiversity movement comes from the autistic people and autistic groups. And I think I've seen, similar to what I've seen in Samuel's orbit, a push to just accept people for who they are, and that people of all different, areas of neurodiversity, all types of ways of thinking, all types of ways of experiencing the world, all types of ways of processing the world, have a place in our society, have a place in the workplace, have a place in education. We still have a tremendous amount of work to do, tremendous amount of work. I mean, the rates of employment are still way too low. But I've seen increasingly more and more articles, movies, that show that this is part of our natural diversity. And I think that's what we really need to see this as, is disability, whether it's neurological disability, physical disability, other disabilities, or mental health disabilities, are part of our diversity and should be embraced as such. And every effort should not be made just focused on fixing people. It should be made on changing the world to make it a more inclusive and accepting place for the diversity of disability.
Yeah, why don't you tell our audience now how they get a hold of you, how they look at all your projects? Let's go through the whole gamut.
Yeah, well, the easiest way is just go to danhabibfilms.org. That's a URL, Dan Habib, DANHABIB films.org. That's got a list of all my projects and links to all my projects. And I would say the best way to get in touch with me now, or to be up to date on what's going to be happening, is go to the website for my current film, intelligentlives.org, and you can contact me there directly through email. You can also just sign up for our e-newsletter, which comes out, maybe every few weeks or a month. We send out some updates to people. We don't sell the list or anything like that.
Well, Dan Habib, thank you so much for being here for another episode of Exploring Different Brains. We hope to have you back very soon, because you are just full of great intellect, great messaging, and great work. Thank you so much for all you're doing.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Exploring Different Brains is a production of Different Brains, Inc. For more information, visit us at differentbrains.org.